mercy of Krishna, my only wish is to have. He opens my darkened eyes and fills my days with the sing of his character.
Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Sloke Bhakti Bhagavati Naistiki. For reciting the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is of our means and conquest, we first offer respectful obeisances unto the personality of Godhead, Lord Narayan. Untanai Narayana Rishi, the supermost human being, Mother Saraswati, the goddess of learning, and Srila Vyasadeva, the author. By regular attendance in classes on the Bhagavad and by rendering service to the pure devotees, all that is troublesome within the heart becomes destroyed, practically nil, and thus loving service unto the glorious Lord, who is praised with transcendental hymns, becomes established as an irrevocable fact. Jai Srimad Bhagavatam Ki. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 7, Further Inquiries by Vidura, text number 31. Prashanda Pattavaishamyam Pratiloma Nivesanam Jivasya Gatayo Yascha Yavatira Guna Karnamaja Prasanda Patta Vaishamyam Pratiloma Niveshanam Jivasya Gatayo Yascha Yavatir Guna Karnamaja Prasanda Patta Vaishamyam Pratiloma Nivesanam Jivasya Gatayo Yascha Yavatir Guna Karnamaja
Prasanda Pata Vaishamyam
Pratiloma Niveshanam Jivasya Gatayo Yascha
Yavatir Guna Karmavi
Yavatir Guna Karmaja Vasanda Padavaishamyam Pratiloma Niveshanam Jivasya Gatayo Yascha Yavatir Guna Karmaja Prasanda Pada, the path of the faithless. Vaishamyam, imperfections by contradiction. Pratiloma, crossbreeding. Niveshana, situation. Jivasya, of the living entity. Gatayaha, movement. Yaha, is they are. Cha, also. Yavati, as many as. Guna, modes of material nature. Karmaja, generated by different work. Translation. Please describe the imperfections and contradictions of the faithless atheists, the situation of crossbreeding, the movements of the living entities in various species of life according to their particular modes of nature and work. Please repeat. Please also describe the imperfections. And contradictions of the faithless atheists. The situation of crossbreeding. And the movements of the living entity. And various species of life. According to their particular modes of nature and work. Srila Prabhupada's divine purport of Ki Jai. The combination of the living entity and different modes of material nature is called crossbreeding. The faithless atheists do not believe in the existence of God, and thus their paths of philosophy are contradictory. Atheistic philosophers never agree with one another. Different species of life are evidence of varieties of mixtures of the modes of material nature. Thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purport to the 31st verse of the 7th chapter of the 3rd canto, Srimad Bhagavatam. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. I offer my respectful obeisances to His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, who is opening our eyes with the torch of knowledge. When will Rupa Goswami Prabhupada, who has established within the material world a mission to fulfill the desire of Lord Chaitanya, give us shelter under His lotus feet? Srila Prabhupada ki. And so here Srila Prabhupada is further educating us by expecting us to help educate ourselves. For example, he says in the purport that faithless atheists do not believe in the existence of God, and thus their paths of philosophy are contradictory, which forces us, if we're really studious, to examine the paths or the philosophies of the atheists and to pick out the contradictions. Of course, there are many in our Western system. In India, there's that one Kapila, and I'm sure others, but it's sort of famous. He's the opposite of the Kapila, who is the son of Mother Devahuti and Kashyapa Muni. Anyway, this particular Kapila atheist propagated that one should enjoy as much ghee as possible. One should enjoy life as much as possible. Because as the atheistic doctrine goes, at the time of death, and all is finished.
John.
Oh yeah, him too. He had that was his philosophy, wasn't it? The other atheist, Kapila, I believe he propounded the Sankhya philosophy, but without spirit of God. Something like Buddhism, in the sense that there is no soul, there is no God. There's only this consciousness coming into being and then being entangled, and repetition of illusory life, repeated birth and death, and until one can disentangle oneself, the consciousness that is there must suffer. So disentangling oneself meant to again become void or nothing. So this is a contradiction. This is a big contradiction in atheism. That we want to be something. We don't want to die, especially to become nothing. A lot of our modern atheists, they don't accept the repetition of birth and death. They don't want to have to struggle. So you reach perfection just by dying, but perfection is just becoming nothing. So it's not a very, it's not a philosophy with a lot of foresight or with a lot of optimism, simply to die and become nothing. Life just doesn't have any purpose other than, as Krishna says in the Gita, for the demons, it is lust only. It's only by lust. So only by this, sexuality, which we see all the way down to the microbes, everything's always reproducing. Life goes on. It is born, it grows, it reproduces. And that is the ultimate purpose, they say, is just to reproduce it. But then you're just going to dwindle and die, and you don't need to worry about anything. Why worry about anything? it's ultimately nothing. It's come out of nothing, and it simply returns to nothing. They claim there's no proof for God, but on the other hand, we say there's no proof for nothing. Where is the proof for nothing? Just that we have materialized the mathematical figure of 0? Is that the proof of nothing? And we see that big nothing makes everything something. We simply put it behind ones, and it becomes tremendous. So it's just a placement in the mathematical system. So they have no proof of nothingness. They try to look through these telescopes and find some hole, but they can't. The hole looks black, so they think there's nothing in there. And they're looking at something so far away, you cannot be 100% sure you're accurate. You just ask others and they all see the same thing. But we humans as a race, we all have the same type of eyes, and nobody's eyes are that much greater than anybody else's eyes. And so we all have the same basic type of senses. And although we're looking through glass that may be empowered with some form of electricity, some form of curvatures and thickness of glass, and what do we know that is millions and millions and millions of miles away? And it simply looks like a black hole to us, but we don't know. We deny that there's life in other places, although we see life all over this planet. We think that just the ingredients of this planet can create life. It needs so much oxygen, it needs so much of this chemical and that chemical, and we can bring about life. But Srila Prabhupada, he used to give the analogy of the blank check. It's just like somebody wanting to pay you with a blank check. They give you a check, but you can't deposit it. So what good is it? Who's to say that they'll have the money in the future? So what good is that blank check? So what good is their proposal that in the future we'll figure this out and we'll create life? It's just a matter of getting the right ingredients in the right proportion, and then bingo, there's consciousness. It's created. And they do this crossbreeding actually. They're constantly grafting things, or they're taking things from some DNA from this, or some of this from that, and they apparently seem to create life, but they're just taking life and put it in a vessel. That's all. And so naturally, just like when the egg and the sperm meet, they create life. So, if you take some type of life, some DNA or whatever from some form of life, and you put it in the proper vessel, then bingo, there may be some life. But they haven't, besides just changing a particular species, they haven't been able to create any sort of species. If they create anything, it's just the same thing that already exists. So even in the future, if they have powers like the mystics of the past, some of them could create universes, with the speak of a species. They're not even sure how many species there are. The Vedas, at least the Vedas, give a figure, 8,400,000 species. But they're uncertain. They've only documented thousands and thousands, from this one planet. And they can't even see that there's life on any other planet. They know that the ingredients are different. If we look at the sun, certainly how can we think, if we're in our material conception that life just comes from the ingredients of this planet, we look at the sun and we think no life there because it's just a burning ball of fire, nuclear energy. Nothing can exist there. But they're limited by their, as Srila Prabhupada would say, their poor fund of knowledge. They can't accept that on different planets, in different atmospheres, that people have different compositions of material elements to create their bodies. So the bodies on the sun are simply fiery bodies, whereas the bodies on the earth are simply, practically water and earth. For the most part, it's 70% water. With some frame to hold up the flesh and the blood that flows around. But on the fiery planet like the sun, you have a fiery body. The only fire we have is just some very strong chemicals to digest food. We call it the fire of digestion. A tiger has much greater fire of digestion. It can eat its prey raw without even cooking it. And it has the proper digestive system to deal with that. But a human being, our digestive system is more fit for the herbs and flowers, fruits and grains, not for eating the carcasses of other living entities. So anyhow, there are a lot of contradictions in atheistic philosophy. I wish I knew more like Shama Sundara. He had a degree in philosophy. I don't know if it was just a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. But he would espouse different philosophies to Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada would point out the fault according to Krishna consciousness in this philosophy. And there were some that were, theistic, some somewhat theistic, and theologians, of course, are expected to be theistic. Theistic meaning that they have a faith in a personal God. But a non-theist or an atheist, an atheist, they have no faith in a personal God, so they come up with all these atheistic philosophies. And they see morality on a relative platform, whereas theists see morality on an absolute platform. This is the morality or the law of God that human behavior is expected to be obedient to. But the atheists, they just think it's relative. The tribal people have this morality, and sophisticated people, based on time, place, and circumstances, they pass laws for their satisfaction. Generally, we don't like murder, so, there can't be no murder in society. Everybody has the right to enjoy. Marijuana is illegal now, but marijuana in the past was illegal. So, based upon, the relative circumstances, they pass laws for simply their enjoyment without any sense of scripture. There may be some religious people there who may make their arguments, but and the democratic republics of the Western world, they're secular governments. So scripture doesn't, other than the faith of the faithful of the individuals, it doesn't have any credence in the making of law. That is done by the representatives of the people with the most votes to make a bill and pass law based upon the constitution of that particular country. So this is modern man simply trying to enjoy. But the people of the near past and the far past, they had faith in scriptures to the extent that even government ruled according to scriptures. Certainly the ancient Vedic culture, that's the big deal in the Muslim world, that it all has to be done according to the Quran, and we have to have our law implemented. And and there's a constant fight between them trying in the Western world, trying to get a majority in establishing their law. But it's not tolerated in a place where people don't have the same faith in their book and the predecessors of that book that established so many of their rules and regulations. So the Krishna consciousness movement is actually meant to create faith in the people, because faith is it may be the beginning of spiritual life, but in this world today, it's an ingredient that not everyone is blessed with, and there are a lot of us that in our humanity that are not blessed with it. We're indoctrinated in schools that are secular, and so naturally it undermines in so many ways. When one studies Darwinian evolution, it undermines Krishna consciousness or faith in God, simply faith in God. That's why we see the Christians are always at odds with atheistic science, and a constant debate. And generally speaking, they lose the debate in the public forum because they're never able to establish their doctrines to even put into the academic books. They can only be put into the books of parochial schools, not into the public school system, simply because they can't win the majority of the scientists to their conclusions. So Srila Prabhupada put a lot of emphasis on creating a scientific branch of his society to attempt to do things like that, to find the faults and be critical of the accepted theories, and then to be able to put forth in such a strong fashion, according to the acceptable laws that are documented, in their books of scientific evidence, be able to put forth philosophy and science that establishes life coming from the most complex being. To say that life comes from nothing is saying that's another big contradiction. Life comes from nothing, so from simplicity comes complexity. But where do we ever see simplicity creating complexity? As Prabhupada and Swarup Damodar would say, where do we ever see life coming from something that's not living? Life comes from life, is the famous book that came out of the conversations between Prabhupada's disciples, Swarup Damodar and Prabhupada. Life comes from life. So from complexity comes complexity, or from complexity comes simplicity. But from the most complex being comes simple beings, like human beings, or even smaller things like different mammals and plants and insects, all the way down to amoebas. But when they're so simple, when we study them from a complex mentality, but when we begin to dissect them, then we see that there's even so much complexity in the most simple forms of life. So what is this, from nothing or from simplicity comes complexity? How can something simple build anything? How can a baby build anything? Its mind's not developed. It is still too simple. It doesn't have enough complexity to be a creator. It cannot do it. So where? Just show us. That's science, that you can show it. Show us where complexity comes from nothing or from simplicity. Simplicity cannot create, practically speaking, or very little. It can murmur some words or some attempt at mimicking some words. But from complexity comes everything. You see, a complex person can create. There was a recent study of a brain of one musician, and he wasn't like Beethoven or some of these other complex musicians who were, astounding in their particular musical adornments. He was a simple guy that played ragtime music, but he had this fascinating brain that could remember so many musical things. He could remember 3 and 4 concerts going on at one time, complex concerts at one time. And he could tell you what note was being played in each one at the same time. Well, in this particular one, this is being played. And in this one, that's being played. So they did a test where they took one person, highly educated musical guy, who wrote concerts and could hear them. And he had a hard time doing that with just two. He said, this is impossible, because you're focused on one and you can say this is going on and that's going on. You can memorize it and say this is what happens at this time and that's what happens at that time. But then when you try to do it with two simultaneously, very difficult. I'm not presenting exactly how they did this scientific test because it involved the brain, where the brain was hearing these things, one, and then it would hear two, and you would have to say what's going on and what's going on in two. But you're just hearing it, it's playing through your brain, and they're studying all the brain waves and all that kind of stuff. So this highly educated person in musicology, he couldn't do it with even two. But this guy, they found him to be absolutely correct with 3 and 4. But as far as making a living, all he did was travel around and play ragtime music because that's what he liked playing. But he had this fantastic, complex musical brain that just astounded people. He could tell you so many things. Just like the guy in the Bugs Bunny comedies. He's just a voice. They draw the cartoon, but there's a voice behind it. So that guy knew 1,500 different voices. He was the voice for Porky the Pig. He was the voice for Donald Duck. He was the voice for Yosemite Sam. He was the voice for so many. Nowadays, since he's passed on, they can find a guy who can maybe do 6. His son can do about 6. But he knew 1,500 of them, to the extent that one time he had a terrible accident. And he was in a coma, and nobody thought he was going to come out of it. The doctors would come there, and there was just nothing. They would say, his name was Jim something. Jim. Just in a deep, deep coma. They didn't think he'd ever come out of it. Finally, one doctor went in, and he said, "Hey, Doc, what's up today, Buzz? Buzz Bunny or whatever it was. What's up?" He said, "Hey," and he answered back in that voice.
Oh my God.
And so then they did it again, and he answered back in that voice. And then they asked him about his name, and he came out of coma. And so then he laid in the hospital in all traction for 8 months because it was such a terrible accident. But he would just work from the hospital. They would bring in all the equipment, and he would just sit there doing it. I mean, what kind of brain is that? So does that kind of complex brain come out of simply an amoeba? They may say, dragged out over a long extent of time. That's their theory, that it drags out over a long extent of time. But where did that time come from? They're again trying to say that something as complex as time comes from nothing or from something simple. But that's not the theist theory at all. It all comes from the most complex being. So complex that in the Muslim world they're afraid to even give it a face. Because it's too complex. It may be offensive. It's like talking about the Wizard of Oz. In the Wizard of Oz, the person behind the scenes that's doing everything, you can't see it. And when they could see it, they found it just to be an ordinary old man in one sense. An ordinary, what do they call it? An absent-minded professor type of guy. But initially, nobody knew it was just a place where everything was coming. And they would talk in a loud voice, and they were all afraid of it because it was the source. But, so even, in the Muslim world, they're afraid to give it a face. In the Vedic world, you have a whole impersonal conception of it. But in reality, it's just the most complex being. And he's so complex that simultaneously he can be the most sweet. His complexity doesn't turn him into some sort of, evil dictator or some sort of dictator that if somebody crosses, his complex creation in some fashion or another, you go against the grain, that you're going to be damned by him. But He's so complex that simultaneously he has the emotions of a loving person, whereby he's just so kind and loving that he helps everyone, even those who go against the grain. He creates a place for them. So, what is this? That from simplicity comes all this complexity that's bewildering all of us. In our little world, we get bewildered, it's so complex. But it's complex far beyond what we can perceive. I mean, what can we perceive with our limited mind and senses? But yet we can certainly perceive a lot of complexity. But the complexity extends far beyond our perception and the perception of our ancestors and the perception of our biggest brains in society that are trying to document it and they're trying to find the sources of life. Although, God has given, so many theistic texts trying to explain to them, it has just come from the most complex being. It may sound simple to you that it comes from the Supreme Person, but it's so simple that you dare not believe it. The faithless won't believe it because they can't believe there's such a complex person. But we see in human society, the greatest leaders, the greatest warriors, athletes, intellects, have all been the most complex beings. And, some of them with, a wonderful, emotional systems, and others with, very tense emotional systems. But, the leaders of society have been the most complex beings. So our most complex beings today, and unless they are faithful to the theistic science, they get nowhere except presenting to us something that is ultimately contradictory. That contradiction being that they present themselves as the most intelligent, they're granted with intelligence far beyond the common man, but then they can't give us anything after this one life. They don't know. They don't know. So what do they know? But our theistic scientists, they can explain life all the way up to the end. They can explain how it goes on in the future. And it's based upon that complex person giving information himself. Why would God make everybody figure it out? Even in our modern world, when we create something, we give a manual with it. The most complex machine, most complex computer, there's a manual with it. The most complex scientific microscopes and telescopes, most complex scientific instruments and robotic robots. There's a manual that goes with it that tells us how it works. There's a whole science of people who simply draw up these things, according to mathematical calculations for people to be able to build it. So why can't God do that? Yes, he does. He gives. He gives in society this information. And people who have followed it, they've been able to sit in meditation and perceive the absolute truth ultimately. And to leave this world in Krishna consciousness or God consciousness and spiritual consciousness. They can separate the illusion from the reality. They can separate themselves, the soul, the Atma, the life, from that which is dead by the process of yoga, which culminates in bhakti or devotion to that supreme person, that most complex person. I mean, after all, that's very intelligent. If there is such a complex person, and I exhibit love to that person, then just like a complex human being that feels love from a small creature like a cat or a dog, how can you mistreat it? No, it goes against the grain of any gentle and loving and kind person. So, same thing. When we exhibit some love to that most complex person, then Krishna is moved and he protects his devotee. No matter what situations devotees in, like in this crossbreeding thing. One may be, the lowest in human society. Just an ordinary worker, not a very prominent worker, just a coolie. All they can do is carry luggage. It's all they can do to make a living. Pull a rickshaw, without really any higher education. But yet, if they're loving to Krishna, then Krishna is loving to them and protects them. We see that even this Pratiloma, there's the famous person that Lord Balaram killed with the kusa straw. And it stated there that his past life was remembered because he had become a disciple of Vyasadeva. He was made a guru and set upon the Vyasasan to expound upon the science of Krishna consciousness and exhibit his learning as a pandit. But when he failed to pay respect to Balaram, his birth was remembered because he was born of Pratiloma parents. I think one a Khatri and one a Brahmin. And so then, that was, Lord Balaram said that, you have become disqualified by disrespect to the personality of Godhead. So therefore, I am remembering your previous birth. What are you doing sitting on a Vyasasan? You're not a pure Brahmin. You were if you followed Vyasadeva and you actually learned to pay respect to the personality of God. Just like us, if we fail to worship the deity and fail to chant the holy name and fail to eat Krishna Prasadam, and we just start eating all sorts of malecha and yavana food, and we start just cussing and cursing like any ordinary malecha and yavana, then what will the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya remember? Well, they'll just remember our previous birth, and we'll just be written off as, someone who had the opportunity but gave it up. Now, of course, that benediction, the Brahmins were so calm because, obviously wasn't an ordinary person sitting on the Vyasasan. So Balaram offered to bring him back to life. But the Brahmin said, no, you have already done this. He went on to his next body. We're sure that Providence will take care of him. But you can give the benediction to his son, Sutta Goswami, who then took the Vyasasan. So, that is, Krishna's greatness is that he can help anyone who's his devotee. Even those who, they're not only pratiloma or crossbred to a higher, position, but they may come from those who, they're not even crossbred. They're just born into the most low of the low. Like, sometimes you see these movies of the Asuras, attacking the Devas, or you may even see it in human society where you have, these malecha tribes, and they attack some, godly human beings, some followers of Vedic culture, and they're all decked out in their Khatri garb, and they have all their astras and weapons and chariots. And these, malecha and Yavana tribes consisting of many more warriors, just attack them with, so much viciousness, wanting to take that kingdom. Even Krishna was attacked by a malecha king. And normally Krishna doesn't even touch such lowly beings. But they have no problem defeating them. Like, the tribal people existed in Vedic civilization. Ram had great love for Guha, who was a tribal king. And they ruled the forest. And they could shoot bows and arrows, and they were quite good, like Native American Indians even. I mean, they could be expert. But when presented to, in any way, cross a Vedic Kshatriya government, they would dare not do so. because they knew the prowess of their weapons, empowered by mantra, was far beyond the ordinary shooting of ordinary bows and arrows like we do today. That whole science is lost. So just like tribal people, they've lost all over the world, indigenous people that had a less superior weaponry system. So because the Europeans created a more powerful weaponry system, they were able to conquer the world simply because their weapons were more potent. Not necessarily that their chivalry was, but their weapons were. And we see when things level off, where the rest of the world also has the same weapons, then everything becomes highly competitive. Extremely competitive. Because it's not so easy all of a sudden just to go into China or to go into any country, even a country like Indonesia. Who can go in and just take it all over? It's not so easy. You may be able to blow it to smithereens, but a place like China may turn around and blow your country to smithereens also. So, anyhow, all this complexity, they dare to say, has come from nothing or from something simple. But that's not science. Science is that complexity comes from complexity. It's all come from Krishna, the most complex, the most perfect person, the most gentle person, the most kind person, but the most intelligent and influential. He knows all the Vedic arts, all the Vedic sciences. He knows all these mantras. He can create anything. All these mystic yogis, they're just like little bitty features of him. They can do a little bit of great mystic wonders. But, Krishna, it's all coming from him. Even the brain of these big, some big atheistic science. Prabhupada used to criticize like that. With their great brains, they should want to understand Krishna instead of challenging Krishna. They use their brain to simply exhibit their poor fund of knowledge. Okay, it's way past time, so I'm going to stop now with my rant on atheism.
Well, one thing is about, since we've been reading about the universal form, it also says that, when you're talking about how that gentleman who could do so many voices, that all those things are like, I'm moving my hand, my finger, speaking. These are demigods. Originally everything's coming from Krishna. I'm the ability in man, but he then he has demigods.
A complex universe.
It's extremely.
Yeah, just like don't we say many times we say somebody who has great musical ability, we say, some falling Gandharva.
Yeah.
Because they're born with it.
Right.
And then there's the planets of those who are born with mystic perfections. They don't have to do all this austere yoga to attain some mystic power. They're born with it.
The thing is that it's not just the brain. That it's there. They may all have the same kind of brain. I mean, I guess I don't know everything about the biology, and there may be brains that are born, or with certain potencies. They're designed in a different way, but ultimately, it's the demigods who are being authorized by Krishna based on the person's previous karma to be able to accomplish different things.
That's right. There's a demigod behind every
like
organ.
It's
amazing.
There was an Indian young mathematician or physicist in the early 1900s, and he was ultimately he was worshipping Saraswati, but he had another name for it. And he came up with this very complex mathematical equation. To this day, they haven't completely understood what it is. But from it, they have gleaned a portion of it, and some of the things that we have, like say cell phones or GPS, have come out of this equation. That they wouldn't have been able to do it without this, and maybe not those things specifically, but there are certain things right now that we consider great progress. And it came from this equation that this Indian village person, he did have some education, who was worshipping a form of Saraswati.
You know what to speak of in Lord Chaitanya's pastime with the Dick Vijay Pandit,
Yeah.
who, you know, his
Yeah.
brain may have been the same, but he had got the mercy of Saraswati, and Saraswati would appear in his tongue.
Right.
And nobody could challenge or defeat him. He could defeat anyone, to the extent that even when he met Mahaprabhu sitting on the bank of the Ganges with his disciples, whom he was astounded by Mahaprabhu's beauty, to the extent that he inquired, who is that person? And then when he heard who it was, he went closer, because Nimai had some reputation. So he went closer. And then when Lord Chaitanya encouraged him to compose some verses on the Ganges, he simply completely astounded every student of Mahaprabhu. It's described in the Chaitanya Bhagavat that their mouths just fell open. They couldn't believe that this was humanly possible. Somebody could compose such beautiful verses so quickly and espouse them like a roll of thunder. 100 couplets of, what we would call 4 lines each. But then Mahaprabhu turns around and picks out a fault in the 50th and 51st verse. In the course of discussion, the Pandit becomes so bewildered that he cannot even offer a never poem. And wants to know why Goddess Saraswati has left him like this.
And she tells him that
Yeah.
he is my Lord, he is the Lord, and I could not allow you